A city bus winding through the streets at dusk, filled with tired commuters just trying to get home. Behind the wheel is Calvin Brooks, a driver who keeps the ride smooth and safe, his steady hands guiding the way. But one passenger, a suit-clad hotshot with a chip on his shoulder, sees a black man in a uniform and decides he's an easy target. With a smirk and a sharp tongue, he mocks Calvin's driving, his competence, his very presence, thinking he's just another nobody. Sound familiar? We've all seen someone judged unfairly, written off before they could even speak. But here's where it gets wild: Calvin isn't just any driver. He's hiding a past that's about to turn this smug passenger's world upside down. When the truth comes out, jaws will drop, phones will light up, and the whole bus will erupt. This isn't just a ride, it's a reckoning, a story of respect, courage, and a hero who doesn't need to shout to be heard. Stick with us, because this moment of justice is one you won't forget. The city bus rumbled through the streets of Richmond, Virginia, its engine a steady growl against the backdrop of early evening traffic. The sky was a bruised purple, the last streaks of daylight fading as streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow through the bus's windows. At the wheel sat Calvin Brooks, his hands steady on the steering wheel, his dark eyes scanning the road with the focus of a man who'd seen worse than rush-hour chaos. His navy blue uniform was crisp, his name tag gleaming under the dashboard lights, and a small silver pin on his lapel caught the occasional glint, a detail most passengers never noticed. At 52, Calvin carried himself with a quiet strength, his broad shoulders and calm demeanor a testament to years of discipline. He'd been driving this route for 3 years, ever since he retired from the army, trading one kind of service for another. To the passengers, he was just the bus driver, a faceless figure who got them from point A to point B. But Calvin was more than that, and tonight, one passenger was about to find out just how much more. The bus was half full, a mix of tired commuters, students with earbuds, and an elderly woman clutching a grocery bag. The air smelled faintly of coffee and city dust, the hum of conversations blending with the creak of seats. Calvin kept his focus on the road, his voice warm but firm as he called out stops over the intercom. "Next up, Franklin Street," he said, his tone steady, professional. Most passengers barely acknowledged him, their eyes glued to phones or out the windows, but Calvin didn't mind. He liked the rhythm of the job, the predictability, the chance to serve without fanfare. It was a far cry from the deserts of his past, where every moment carried the weight of life and death. At the next stop, a man in a gray suit climbed aboard, his face flushed from the chilly evening air. He was in his late 30s, with slick back hair and a scowl that seemed permanent. He swiped his fare card with an impatient flick, muttering under his breath as he scanned the bus for a seat. Calvin glanced at him through the rearview mirror, noting the man's tense posture, the way his eyes darted around like he was looking for something to criticize. "Evening," Calvin said, his voice polite but neutral. The man, whose name tag read, Todd, financial advisor, didn't respond, just huffed and dropped into a seat near the front, his briefcase thumping against the floor. As the bus pulled back into traffic, Todd leaned forward, his voice loud enough to cut through the low hum of the cabin. "Hey, driver, you gonna speed this up or what? Some of us have places to be." His tone was sharp, laced with a condescension that made a few passengers glance up, their expressions a mix of annoyance and unease. Calvin kept his eyes on the road, his grip steady on the wheel. "Doing my best, sir," he said, his voice calm, unruffled. "Traffic's heavy tonight." Todd scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yeah, right. Just do your job, man." The words carried a sting, a hint of something uglier beneath the surface, and the air in the bus shifted, the passengers' attention now fixed on the exchange. Calvin didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of tension in his otherwise steady demeanor. He'd heard comments like that before, passengers who saw his skin, his uniform, and assumed they could talk down to him. But Calvin was no stranger to adversity, and he knew how to pick his battles. He glanced in the mirror again, catching Todd's smirk, the way he leaned back like he owned the bus. Something told Calvin this wasn't over, that Todd's impatience was just the spark for a bigger fire. And when that fire came, Calvin would be ready, his past waiting to step into the light. The bus rolled through Richmond's bustling streets, its engine humming steadily as streetlights cast flickering shadows across the worn seats. Calvin Brooks kept his hands firm on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road with a precision honed by years of navigating far more dangerous terrain. The silver pin on his lapel glinted faintly under the dashboard lights, unnoticed by the passengers absorbed in their phones or staring out into the dusk. The air inside the bus was thick with the scent of city dust and the low murmur of conversations, but a new tension had settled in, sparked by Todd's sharp words. His comment, "Just do your job, man," still hung in the air, its edge cutting deeper than he'd intended. Calvin's face remained calm, his posture steady, but inside, he felt the familiar weight of being judged, not for his actions, but for who he was. He'd faced it before, in uniform and out, and he knew how to handle it. But tonight, something about Todd's tone told him this was only the beginning. Todd, the gray-suited passenger, leaned back in his seat near the front, his briefcase propped against his leg, his scowl deepening as the bus hit a red light. He muttered something under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to catch the irritation in his voice. A young woman with earbuds glanced at him, then quickly away, her fingers tightening around her phone. An older man in a worn jacket shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to Calvin, then back to the floor. The bus was a microcosm of the city, people from all walks, bound together for a fleeting moment, now witnesses to a brewing storm. Calvin called out the next stop, Broad Street, his voice steady over the intercom, but his rearview mirror caught Todd's restless movements, the way he tapped his foot like he was counting down to something. "Come on, driver, this is ridiculous," Todd said, his voice louder now, carrying over the hum of the engine. "You're crawling like we've got all night. I've got a meeting to get to." His tone was sharp, laced with a condescension that made the young woman with earbuds pull one out, her brow furrowing. Calvin kept his eyes on the road, his voice even as he responded. "Traffic's tight, sir. I'm keeping it safe for everyone." His words were polite, professional, but there was a steel beneath them, a quiet defiance that Todd either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "Safe?" Todd scoffed, leaning forward, his briefcase sliding against the seat. "You're just slow. Maybe they should get someone who knows how to drive this thing." The insult was blatant now, and the bus went quiet, the murmurs fading as passengers turned their heads. The older man in the jacket shook his head, muttering, "That's uncalled for," under his breath. The young woman with earbuds frowned, her phone now lowered, her eyes fixed on Todd. Calvin's hands tightened on the wheel, just enough to betray the tension he was keeping in check. He'd heard worse, far worse, in his years of service, both on the battlefield and on these streets. But Todd's words weren't just about the bus. They were about Calvin, about the assumptions he carried, the kind that saw a black man in a driver's uniform and decided he was less. Calvin glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Todd's smirk, the way he sat back like he'd won something. "I'm doing my job, sir," Calvin said, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that made a few passengers nod in approval. "We'll get you there on time." But Todd wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward again, his voice rising, drawing every eye on the bus. "Your job. Man, you're barely keeping this thing on the road. Maybe stick to something simpler next time." The words were a gut punch, and the young woman with earbuds gasped, her hand covering her mouth. The older man in the jacket straightened, his eyes narrowing, while a teenage boy in a hoodie pulled out his phone, discreetly starting to record. The tension was palpable now, the bus a pressure cooker of unspoken outrage. Calvin's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on the road, guiding the bus through a turn with steady hands. He could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes, some sympathetic, others curious, all waiting to see how he'd respond. He thought of his years in the army, the missions where he'd kept his cool under fire, the lives he'd saved, the medals pinned to his chest. That silver pin on his lapel wasn't just decoration, it was a symbol of a past Todd couldn't even imagine. But Calvin wasn't ready to play that card yet. He wanted Todd to keep talking, to dig his own grave a little deeper. At the next stop, a new passenger climbed aboard, a woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back, a nurse's badge clipped to her coat. She swiped her fare card, glancing at Calvin with a warm smile. "Evening, Calvin," she said, her voice kind, familiar. "Rough night?" Calvin nodded, his smile small but genuine. "Just another day, Miss Evelyn," he said, his tone carrying a warmth that contrasted with Todd's hostility. Miss Evelyn took a seat near the front, her eyes flicking to Todd, then back to Calvin, like she could sense the storm brewing. She'd ridden this route for years, knew Calvin's story, or at least parts of it, and her presence felt like a quiet anchor in the chaos. Todd, undeterred, leaned forward again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, great, you're buddies with the passengers now. No wonder this bus is a mess." The jab was personal, meant to sting, and it did. The teenage boy's phone was still recording, his lens catching Todd's sneer, Calvin's steady profile. Miss Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her lips pursing, but she stayed silent, her gaze fixed on Calvin like she was waiting for him to take the lead. The young woman with earbuds shook her head, muttering, "This guy's unbelievable," loud enough for those nearby to hear. The older man in the jacket leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Hey, man, ease up. He's just driving the bus." Calvin pulled the bus to a stop at a red light, his eyes meeting Todd's in the rearview mirror. "Sir, I'm getting everyone where they need to go," he said, his voice calm but carrying a warning. "You got a problem, we can talk at the end of the route." The offer was polite, but it was a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. Todd smirked, leaning back, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty, like he'd finally sensed he might be pushing too far. The bus was a powder keg now, the passengers' attention locked on the exchange, their phones ready to capture what came next. Calvin knew this wasn't over, that Todd's ego wouldn't let him back down. But he also knew something Todd didn't, his past, his strength, his story. And when the truth came out, it would hit harder than any insult Todd could throw. The Richmond City bus rattled along its route, the engine's low growl blending with the hum of evening traffic as streetlights cast long shadows across the seats. Calvin Brooks gripped the steering wheel with steady hands, his eyes fixed on the road, but the tension inside the cabin was thicker than the diesel fumes. Todd's latest jab, "No wonder this bus is a mess," hung in the air like a storm cloud, sparking murmurs and sidelong glances from the passengers. The young woman with earbuds had her phone out now, her expression a mix of outrage and disbelief as she recorded. The teenage boy in the hoodie was still filming, his lens catching every flicker of Todd's sneer. Ms. Evelyn, the nurse seated near the front, sat with her arms crossed, her eyes sharp as she watched the scene unfold. The older man in the worn jacket shook his head, his muttered disapproval adding to the growing chorus of discontent. Calvin felt their support, their quiet anger, but he kept his focus, his years of discipline keeping him calm. This wasn't his first battle, and it wouldn't be his last. Todd leaned forward again, his gray suit creased, his voice louder now, as if he needed the whole bus to hear his indignation. "You know, I pay taxes for this service," he said, his tone dripping with entitlement. "The least you could do is drive like you've got somewhere to be. Or is that too much for you?" The words were a knife, sharp and personal, and the bus went silent, the passengers' eyes darting between Todd and Calvin. The young woman with earbuds gasped, her voice low but audible. "Are you serious right now?" The teenage boy adjusted his phone, zooming in on Todd's face, while Miss Evelyn's lips tightened, her gaze boring into him like she was sizing up a patient who just refused treatment. Calvin's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles brushing against the silver pin on his lapel, a small, unassuming emblem that carried a weight Todd couldn't comprehend. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but carrying a steel edge, "I'm driving this bus safely for everyone on it. You want to talk taxes, talk to City Hall. I'm doing my job." His words were calm, measured, but they landed like a quiet challenge, a warning that Todd was pushing into dangerous territory. The older man in the jacket nodded, muttering, "Damn right," loud enough for those nearby to hear. The young woman with earbuds shook her head, her fingers tapping her phone as she whispered to the person next to her, "This guy's about to get wrecked." Todd scoffed, undeterred, his ego driving him deeper into the hole he was digging. "Your job," he said, his voice rising, his briefcase thumping against the seat as he gestured. "If you were any good at it, we wouldn't be stuck in this crawl. Maybe they should get someone who can handle the pressure." The insult was blatant, its undertone unmistakable, and the bus erupted in murmurs. A college student in the back called out, "Yo, chill, man." While Ms. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "You need to stop talking," she said, her eyes locked on Todd. "He's doing more for this city than you'll ever know." Her words carried a weight that made Todd pause, his smirk faltering for the first time. At that moment, the bus pulled into a busy stop at Carey Street, where a new passenger climbed aboard, a man in his 40s, dressed in a navy blazer, his posture stiff but purposeful. He swiped his fare card, glancing at Calvin with a nod. "Evening, Sergeant Brooks," he said, his voice carrying a quiet respect that cut through the tension like a beacon. Calvin returned the nod, his expression softening slightly. "Evening, Captain," he replied, his tone warm but professional. The exchange was brief, but it sent a ripple through the bus. Todd's eyes narrowed, his head snapping toward the new passenger, who took a seat near Ms. Evelyn. The young woman with earbuds whispered, "Sergeant?" To the teenage boy, who nodded, his phone still recording, his eyes wide with curiosity. The man in the blazer, Captain Robert Hayes, as his ID badge read, leaned toward Ms. Evelyn, his voice low but audible. "Calvin's one of the best we ever had," he said, his eyes flicking toward Todd. "Saved my life in Fallujah. Guy's a hero." Ms. Evelyn nodded, her expression proud but unsurprised, like she'd known there was more to Calvin than his uniform. The passengers nearby leaned in, catching snippets of the conversation, their murmurs growing louder. The teenage boy's phone zoomed in on Calvin, capturing the silver pin on his lapel, a Distinguished Service Cross, though most wouldn't recognize it. The young woman with earbuds gasped, her voice a whisper. "A hero? For real?" Todd, still seated near the front, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence cracking. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice loud but less certain now, his eyes darting between Calvin and Captain Hayes. "You're saying he's some kind of soldier?" His tone was skeptical, almost mocking, but it carried a hint of unease, like he was starting to sense he'd miscalculated. Calvin kept his eyes on the road, pulling the bus back into traffic, but his rearview mirror caught Todd's expression, the way his hands fidgeted with his briefcase. "I'm just the driver tonight, sir," Calvin said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet power. "You got questions, ask them at the end of the route." Captain Hayes leaned forward, his voice clear and deliberate. "Not just a soldier," he said, his eyes locked on Todd. "Sergeant Calvin Brooks, decorated war hero. Led a squad through hell and brought them back alive. You might want to think twice before you talk to him like that." The words hit like a shockwave, and the bus erupted in gasps. The young woman with earbuds clapped a hand over her mouth, her phone nearly slipping from her grip. The teenage boy whispered, "No way," his lens still rolling. Ms. Evelyn's smile was small but fierce, her eyes glinting with pride. The older man in the jacket nodded, his voice low. Knew he was something special. Todd's face went pale, his hands frozen on his briefcase, his earlier bravado evaporating. That's not what I meant," he stammered, his voice weak, his eyes darting around the bus as if searching for an escape. The passengers were openly staring now, their phones raised, their murmurs turning to a low roar of disapproval. The college student in the back called out, "Apologize, man." While another passenger, a woman in a business suit, shook her head, muttering, "Unbelievable." Calvin kept driving, his expression unchanged, but his eyes in the rearview mirror carried a spark of something, resolve, maybe, or the quiet certainty of a man who'd faced worse than Todd and come out stronger. The bus pulled into the next stop, and Captain Hayes stood, his blazer crisp, his presence commanding. "Calvin, you need me to stick around?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Calvin shook his head, his smile small but genuine. "I've got this, Captain," he said. "But thanks." Hayes nodded, clapping Calvin on the shoulder as he stepped off the bus. The doors closed, and the cabin was alive with tension, every eye on Todd, who sat frozen, his world unraveling. Calvin's past was no longer a secret, and the stage was set for a reckoning that would leave the entire bus, and soon, the internet, speechless. The Richmond City bus hummed along its route, the engine's steady rumble a stark contrast to the charged silence inside the cabin. Calvin Brooks kept his eyes on the road, his hands firm on the steering wheel, the silver pin on his lapel, a distinguished service cross, glinting faintly under the dashboard lights. The revelation from Captain Hayes had hit like a grenade, leaving the passengers stunned and Todd, the gray-suited financial advisor, shrinking in his seat. His earlier bravado, mocking Calvin's driving, questioning his competence, had crumbled under the weight of the truth. Calvin wasn't just a bus driver, he was a decorated war hero, a man who'd saved lives in the chaos of Fallujah. The young woman with earbuds sat wide-eyed, her phone still recording, while the teenage boy in the hoodie zoomed in on Todd's ashen face. Ms. Evelyn, the nurse, sat with a quiet smile, her arms crossed, her eyes gleaming with pride. The older man in the worn jacket nodded to himself, muttering, knew he was more than meets the eye. The bus was a stage now, and Calvin was center stage, his quiet strength commanding every gaze. Todd's hands fidgeted with his briefcase, his earlier smirk replaced by a look of panic, like a man realizing he'd stepped into quicksand. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the engine's hum, his eyes darting to the passengers who were now openly staring. Their phones were raised, capturing every flinch, every bead of sweat on his forehead. The college student in the back leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Didn't know. You didn't care." The young woman with earbuds nodded, her voice low but cutting. "You were out here acting like you own the bus, disrespecting him for no reason." The murmurs grew louder, a chorus of disapproval that made Todd shrink further into his seat, his face flushed with shame. Calvin's voice broke the tension, calm and steady over the intercom as he announced the next stop. "Monument Avenue, coming up." His tone was professional, unruffled, but it carried a weight that silenced the cabin. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Todd's eyes for a brief moment. There was no anger in Calvin's gaze, just a quiet certainty, the kind forged in battles far harder than this one. He'd faced worse than Todd's insults, enemy fire, impossible odds, the weight of lives in his hands. This was just another challenge, and Calvin knew how to meet it head-on. Ms. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice firm but measured. "You owe him an apology," she said, her eyes locked on Todd. "You don't get to talk to a man like that, especially not one who's done what he has." Her words were a command, not a suggestion, and the passengers nodded, their murmurs turning to calls of, "Yeah, apologize." And, "Say something." The teenage boy's phone was still rolling, his lens catching the growing pressure on Todd, who looked like he wanted to disappear. The older man in the jacket added, "Man risked his life for this country, and you're whining about traffic? Show some respect." Todd's mouth opened, then closed, his hands trembling as he clutched his briefcase like a shield. "I didn't mean. I wasn't trying to," he started, his voice cracking under the weight of the crowd's stares. But before he could finish, the bus pulled into Monument Avenue, and the doors hissed open. A new passenger stepped on, a woman in her 30s, her military fatigues faded but crisp, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She swiped her fare card, her eyes landing on Calvin with a flash of recognition. "Sergeant Brooks?" she said, her voice warm but tinged with surprise. "Didn't expect to see you driving this route." Calvin smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened his stoic demeanor. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, nodding. "Good to see you. Just keeping the wheels turning." The woman, Lieutenant Carter, glanced at the tense cabin, her eyes narrowing as she caught Todd's flushed face and the passenger's pointed stares. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone sharp, like she was ready to step into a firefight. Ms. Evelyn spoke up, her voice clear. "This guy's been disrespecting Sergeant Brooks, acting like he's better than him. Didn't know he was talking to a war hero." Lieutenant Carter's eyes widened, then hardened as she turned to Todd. "You serious?" she said, her voice low but lethal. "You're picking a fight with the man who pulled 3 soldiers out of a burning Humvee under fire? You've got some nerve." The bus erupted in gasps, the passengers' phones capturing every word. The young woman with earbuds whispered, "A Humvee? Under fire?" The teenage boy's jaw dropped, his phone shaking slightly as he zoomed in on Calvin, whose expression remained calm, almost detached, like he was used to his past being a shock to others. Todd's face was a mask of horror, his hands now gripping his briefcase so tightly his knuckles were white. I didn't know," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes darting to Calvin, then away, unable to meet the driver's steady gaze. Calvin pulled the bus back into traffic, his voice calm over the intercom. "Next stop, Gray Street." But the passengers weren't focused on the route anymore. Lieutenant Carter took a seat near Ms. Evelyn, her duffel bag thumping against the floor. "Sergeant Brooks got the Distinguished Service Cross for that," she said, her voice carrying to the whole bus. "Risked his life to save his squad. Most of us wouldn't be here without him." Her words were a bombshell, and the cabin buzzed with awe. The college student in the back clapped, shouting, "That's what I'm talking about." The older man in the jacket nodded, his eyes misty. "Hero, plain and simple." Todd sank lower in his seat, his face burning, his earlier arrogance replaced by a desperate need to escape. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible, directed at no one in particular. But the passengers weren't letting him off that easy. The young woman with earbuds leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Say it to him," she said, pointing at Calvin. "You disrespected him to his face, so own it." The teenage boy nodded, his phone still recording, his eyes bright with anticipation. Ms. Evelyn's gaze was unrelenting, her voice firm. "Go on, say it. Mean it." Calvin glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Todd's for a moment. "It's all right," he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet power. "I don't need an apology. I just need people to think before they speak." His words were simple, but they landed like a verdict, silencing Todd completely. The bus pulled into Gray Street, and Lieutenant Carter stood, her fatigues rustling as she clapped Calvin on the shoulder. "You're still the best, Sergeant," she said, her voice warm. "Don't let anyone tell you different." She stepped off, leaving the cabin charged with her words. The passengers erupted in applause, their cheers filling the bus as Todd sat frozen, his briefcase a useless shield. Calvin kept driving, his hands steady, his eyes on the road. He'd faced worse than Todd's insults, bullets, bombs, the weight of lives in his hands. This was just another mission, and he'd handled it with the same grace he always had. But the truth was out now, and the stage was set for a moment that would echo far beyond this bus. The Richmond City bus rumbled through the evening streets, its engine a steady pulse against the fading light. Calvin Brooks guided it with unwavering focus, his hands steady on the wheel, the silver Distinguished Service Cross pin on his lapel catching the occasional glint from passing streetlights. The cabin was still buzzing from Lieutenant Carter's bombshell revelation. Calvin, the unassuming driver, was a war hero who'd saved lives under fire in Fallujah. The passengers' applause had faded, but their energy lingered, a mix of awe and righteous indignation directed at Todd, who sat slumped in his front row seat, his gray suit wrinkled, his briefcase clutched like a lifeline. His earlier arrogance, mocking Calvin's driving, questioning his competence, had been shattered, replaced by a humiliated silence. The young woman with earbuds kept her phone raised, her eyes flicking between Todd and Calvin, while the teenage boy in the hoodie recorded every moment, his lens capturing the tension. Ms. Evelyn, the nurse, sat with a quiet, triumphant smile, her gaze steady on Todd, who avoided her eyes. The older man in the worn jacket nodded to himself, his expression one of quiet respect for Calvin. The bus rolled to a stop at a traffic light, the red glow casting a soft hue over the cabin. The passengers' murmurs had settled, but their attention remained fixed on Todd, whose face was a mask of shame and panic. His weak apology, "I'm sorry," had fallen flat, dismissed by the young woman's sharp demand to say it to him. Calvin, however, had brushed it off with a calm, "I don't need an apology. I just need people to think before they speak." His words had silenced the cabin, their weight sinking in like a verdict. Now, as the light turned green, Calvin eased the bus forward, his voice steady over the intercom. "Next stop, Main Street." His tone was professional, almost serene, but it carried a power that filled the space, a reminder of the man he was beyond the driver's seat. Todd shifted in his seat, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his briefcase. "I didn't mean it like that," he muttered, his voice barely audible, directed more to himself than anyone else. But the passengers weren't letting him off. The college student in the back leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You meant it exactly like that," he said, his phone now out, joining the others recording. "You thought you could talk down to him because he's the driver. Now you know better." The young woman with earbuds nodded, her voice cutting. "You didn't care who he was. You just saw a black man and decided he wasn't good enough." Her words were a blade, and Todd flinched, his face burning redder under the weight of the truth. Miss Evelyn spoke up, her voice calm but unyielding. "You don't get to slide out of this," she said, her eyes locked on Todd. "You disrespected a man who's done more for this country than most of us ever will. You owe him more than a half-baked apology." The older man in the jacket nodded, his voice low but firm. "Damn right. You don't talk to a hero like that." The cabin buzzed with agreement, passengers murmuring, some clapping softly, their phones still capturing the moment. The teenage boy whispered to the person next to him, "This is gonna blow up online," his excitement barely contained. Calvin kept driving, his eyes on the road, but his rearview mirror caught the scene unfolding behind him. He'd faced moments like this before, not just on this bus, but in the army, in civilian life, in countless places where his skin made him a target before he could even speak. He thought of Fallujah, of the burning Humvee, the screams of his squad, the split-second decisions that saved lives. He thought of the medals pinned to his chest, the quiet pride of his family, the daughter waiting at home who called him her hero. This bus, this moment, was nothing compared to that. But it mattered, not for him, but for everyone watching, for the passengers who'd seen a wrong and demanded it be made right. The bus pulled into Main Street, the doors hissing open as a few passengers stepped off and others climbed aboard. One of them, a young man in a delivery uniform, glanced at Calvin with a nod. "You're that driver from the news, right?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of recognition. Calvin raised an eyebrow, his smile small but genuine. "News?" he said, his tone light. "Just driving the bus, man." The young man grinned, taking a seat near Ms. Evelyn, who leaned over and whispered, "He's more than that. You'll see." The new passenger's eyes widened, sensing the tension in the air, and he pulled out his phone, joining the growing chorus of cameras. Todd stood abruptly, his briefcase clutched to his chest, his eyes darting to the open doors. "This is my stop," he mumbled, his voice shaky as he moved toward the exit. But the young woman with earbuds wasn't done. "You're just gonna run?" she called out, her phone still raised. "You can't even look him in the eye and say sorry?" The college student chimed in, "Yeah, man, own it." The passengers' voices rose, a wave of demands for accountability that stopped Todd in his tracks. He turned, his face a mix of shame and defiance, and looked at Calvin, who met his gaze in the rearview mirror. "I'm sorry, okay?" Todd said, his voice louder now, but it cracked under the pressure. "I didn't know who you were." The words were weak, and the passengers groaned, their disapproval clear. Calvin shook his head, his voice calm but firm. It's not about who I am, he said, his eyes steady. It's about how you treat people when you don't know. Think about that next time. The words landed like a gavel, and the bus erupted in applause, the sound filling the cabin as Todd stumbled off, his head down, his briefcase banging against his leg. As the doors closed, the passengers cheered louder, their voices a chorus of support. Ms. Evelyn clapped, her smile wide, while the teenage boy pumped his fist, his phone still recording. "That's my driver," he shouted, and the others laughed, their energy lifting the cabin. Calvin kept driving, his expression unchanged, but a small smile tugged at his lips. By morning, the videos would be everywhere, X, TikTok, local news, spreading his story faster than he could have imagined. But for Calvin, it wasn't about the spotlight. It was about the principle, about showing that respect wasn't optional, no matter who you were. To everyone watching this, think about the times you've been judged, dismissed, or talked down to because of how you look or what you do. Those moments hurt, but they also remind us to stand tall, to demand better. Calvin Brooks didn't just drive a bus, he drove home a lesson in respect, proving that heroes don't need to shout to be heard. So, what's your story? When did you stand up, push back, or prove someone wrong? Drop it in the comments, I want to hear it. And if this hit home, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more. We're building a world where everyone gets the respect they deserve, and you're part of it. Let's keep rolling.